Okay, good evening, Dad.
Good morning.
Or it's afternoon now, I guess, technically for me.
Oh,
But
true.
okay,
Good point. Okay.
today is Friday, July 25th. And let's just start. What's on your mind? What's the big news story that you think we should be looking at right now?
The big news story. I guess probably the biggest news story is apparent breakthrough around Prokofsk. We were talking about the semi-encirclement of Prokofsk. The Russians clearly had were extending their pincers around the city. We're close to enforcing, and I think you could say now that they are able to impose a combination, physical and fire control encirclement of the city. Um, so it's very, very difficult now for the troops that are the Ukrainian troops that are within Prokos to be supplied. I mean, it's a there there are some roads remaining, but they're few, and they are constantly under fire, artillery fire, and drone fire. Oh, yeah, that's something that we talked about. Now, there was also the news that the we call them DRG. I guess they're diversionary reconnaissance groups. Russians had actually penetrated deep within the city in the west and the south, and that's ongoing. And it seems to the information is limited because actually both sides, and this often happens in heated battles, actually tend to impose some sort of radio silence. You could call it. They become very sparing with their information. But we do know that actually some very important breakthroughs were made in the north of Pokrovsk and at the same time around Konstantinovka. So it sounds like, this is a city that is very important to the Ukrainians, kind of like Avdiivka was last year. And it's key. You asked me last time whether it would be the key battle. I say, we don't know how long this war is going to go on. So it's too early to say what's going to be considered the key battle, but it's one of the key battles. I think it's clear. And when it falls, and it definitely will fall, the other dominoes will fall. Um, there's of course Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and then that really will be Donbass. That will be the end. So we're looking at the beginning of the end of the battle for Donbass. So, this is important. It reminds me of the Avdiivka battle. If you remember, that started, in the fall of 2022, or no, 2023, excuse me, and it ended in 2024. And at first it was rather slow, and you could see, the same sort of thing. The Russians started to extend their pincers around Avdiivka. They didn't actually ever go as far as they've done with Pokrovsk. They never were able to impose it kind of like a total siege on the city to create a true cauldron. But it looks like they're doing that with Pokrovsk. But anyway, they at least a semicircle around Avdiivka. And then all of a sudden you got the news that the Russians were actually within the city of Avdiivka. And then things started to move real fast, and Avdiivka fell. It looked like it was going to be weeks, and it turned out to be a matter of days. Now we can't say for sure that the same thing's happening, but it's looking like it. It seems to be something very similar. They tighten the noose, and then all of a sudden, boom! They storm the city, and I think that's what we're seeing. So it could fall a lot quicker than what most of us expected. I think people figured it would be months, but weeks and maybe even days, I think, would be a better way to a more accurate prediction. And then that will be an important step. That towards the a big step forward for the Russians.
What do you predict will happen once it does fall? Do you think that Zelensky's position becomes even more tenuous, or that really what I think we're kind of waiting for is that it'll get to a point where either NATO commits fully or Ukraine collapses, and we're just getting closer and closer to that deadline. So, do you feel like what's your
Yeah.
assessment of that? Do you agree?
Yes, that's a hard one to call. I mean, the question of like, when is Ukrainian morale really going to collapse? I think a lot of us, or almost all of us, have been surprised by how long they've stayed in the fight in spite of everything. Clearly many of them are not willing to fight. We see that. Some of them certainly are and are very experienced fighters. I've heard it said that, who was it? I think it was Daniel Davis, actually, the tank commander, said that the best army in the world, in his opinion, was the Russian army, and the second best is the Ukrainian army. And because they've learned they're the only two armies in the world that have fought, this 21st century combat, this new drone warfare. It's a whole new thing, and they've learned how to fight it, and they are, they're constantly improving their tactics, the Russians come up with something new and the Ukrainians are forced to adapt. The Ukrainians come up with something new, the Russians are forced to adapt. They're in this arms race, you can say, and it's going forward at breakneck speed. So that puts these two armies really ahead of every other army on the planet. I mean, you look at the Chinese; they look very good on paper. I mean, they have many very good weapons. I'm sure, in such a large country, they are a formidable army, but they don't have the combat experience. They haven't fought since 1979. And, there's really not even too many lessons that you can draw from that war because things have changed so much in the meantime. I guess what I'm saying is that, okay, Ukraine has put up a very good fight, but it has its limits. It's overmatched. It's growing weaker. The Russians are growing stronger. There is some point where, where they just won't be able to hold the line at all anymore. You can see, especially in the last few days, there have been breakthroughs. The Russian advance, which is, you still have to say is, kind of incremental, but it is accelerating and it's breaking through in very, very important points. Okay, there will be something of a collapse. It may be something of a slow motion collapse. It doesn't mean that it'll happen in a day, but maybe over the course of the month, we'll see of a month somewhere, we'll see the lines truly collapse. And then what will the repercussions be for Zelensky? Well, it's hard to know. He's under pressure. For the first time, we haven't ever seen this before, but the Europeans and his own people are denouncing him in a way that we never saw before. The protests that we talked about last time continue. They haven't abated. He made an attempt, actually, after he announced that he was going to, transfer these anti-corruption agencies from under essentially Western NGO control, under his own prosecutor general. So, in other words, these agencies were going to lose their independence. He made that decision. He had it. The RADA passed it for him, and it shows actually quite quickly. It shows the RADA is basically his creature. It does what he wants. But then the protests happen, and it seemed to have taken him by surprise. He said, okay, yeah, I made a mistake. I listened to the people. We're going to roll this back. And last I heard, the vote will be taken next week. There's a lot of people are suspicious about whether it really will be rolled back. It's just an attempt at kind of to blow smoke in the eyes of the people and the Westerners. One thing, he already has arrested a certain number of people within these agencies. He claims that they're Russian spies, which you have to say is not impossible. Of course, the Russians have spies, all throughout Ukraine. But he also, like the rest of the Western world, he's always using the Russia excuse. That was the excuse he used for cracking down on it. And his own people didn't believe it. They didn't go for the Russia excuse in this case, and they could see what was happening. I guess the rumors are, and what Ukrainians generally believe, is that these agencies were beginning to do investigations closely connected into people very closely connected to him. And that's probably what he was reacting to. Now, was this just something that these agencies launched on their own, just because of their concern for justice and their hatred of corruption? Well, I can't say that's impossible. I'm sure there are some people in those agencies that are generally just, their main purpose is to end corruption. But we do know that these are essentially Western controlled. So it makes you at least suspicious that this is something that has been launched by the West. And if it is, it does show, we also mentioned the Seymour Hersh story and other and articles that have appeared in mainstream papers. Yeah, he's in trouble. I mean, or at least let's see. There's clear that there is some sort of effort, within the Western establishment to push him aside. Now, it may be that there are others that are supporting him, and in any case, over the years, he has really gained very tight control over the machinery of his government. The people around him are very, very loyal to him. He has control over the Rada, and he's suppressed all opposition parties. It's not going to be easy to get rid of him. We don't know. There does seem to be some kind of effort. Again, people have pointed out, like with these protests that are ongoing, we haven't had any protests on this scale before. And very unusually, there are a lot of young men out there. Generally, young men do not go out in the open, especially where they can, what happens to them is they get conscripted. And so they're generally hiding in basements or dressing up as women and, but they were out there. So I think that maybe they received the signal and maybe were directly employed by NGOs and said, we want you out there. We want pressure on Zelensky. So yeah, there seems to be something afoot. I don't know how serious it is, whether or not if the entire West is behind it or it's just a faction. Maybe there are people who still are going to who still want to see Zelensky there, people within the Western establishment, but he's got to be worried, and it clearly he is. I mean, that sudden reversal, I think, shows a certain amount of nervousness. And then, yeah, any bad news from the front just adds to his woes. We'll see.
Yeah, it sounds like there is essentially an NGO class. It's something that I heard the Alexes on Duran talk about, and you were kind of mentioning it on our last conversation as well. These anti-corruption agencies were set up by the United States. What are they, like Sabu, Nabu, something Jar Jar Binks, Star Wars sounding? I forget.
Yeah, Nabu and Sapo. Yeah, NABU right. And SAPO. Right.
Right. So those were essentially set up by the Americans and controlled the Americans. So it's something that I didn't really think about, that you have a whole group of people within Ukraine that are part of this NGO class. Essentially, it's almost like there are two kind of governments in Ukraine. There's Zelensky's government in the Rada, and then there's the unofficial shadow government where the United States has been pumping all of its influence. And we know that it has to be extensive because I remember seeing a video of Victoria Nuland, this is a while ago, saying how they pumped in over $5 billion into Ukraine, leading up to the Maidan, and just openly bragging about it. So like, okay, that's a lot of money. And you're talking about Eastern Europe. How many people are you employing? How big is this operation? How many NGOs and entities? Right. And like you said, so these people that came out, most of the men have either fled or have gone to the front or died or they're in hiding. So it's like there is this whole other class of people in Ukraine that are directly affiliated with the United States in some way, directly or indirectly being funded by the United States. And you wonder, I think a lot of those people are, what they're doing is controlling the propaganda information, the war. I think a lot of that's what it is. All those, Doge, NAFO avatar guys, that's probably what a lot of those guys are out there is what I'm thinking. Do you have any idea how big this NGO class is, or do you believe what am I saying? Is it ridiculous, or is that true?
No, it's huge. I know about the $5 billion quote. It's if you recall, it wasn't too long ago, just a few months ago, that USAID was essentially shut down. Remember, later it was transferred to the State Department. But when it was shut down, immediately these media organizations within Ukraine started squealing, and we realized a lot more than half of Ukrainian media was basically funded by the West. Much of it through USAID. Yeah,
I think
it was very high percentage. It was very, very high, right? And many of them were getting their funding through USAID. Now, didn't hear anything about them later. Maybe they just shriveled up, but you have there are ways. I know that Europeans stepped in certain cases and said, okay, well, if the Americans or USAID is not going to fund you, we'll do it. And so I'm sure that these information warriors, these various propaganda outfits, they're probably still there. And, maybe there's been a change in funding, but they're still there. And, it's something that's always been there. We haven't really even thought about it with, I think, we only noticed it when they were cut off and they began squealing and realized, wait a second, this is a big part of what's going on in Ukraine. But in general, it's because they've been working hand in glove with the government. I think that's why. So, Zelensky hadn't been looking at them as opposition. They're just part of Western support as far as he, in his view. Now, of course, in Georgia, the government was in direct opposition with these NGOs, and we had that, a real standoff, which the government, eventually won in Georgia. But in Ukraine, we haven't seen that because, again, they've been allies. But something changed, and that's very interesting. Something changed when he went after, Nabu and Sapo. And, and then all of a sudden these people were out on the streets, and I think they could only be out on the streets if the NGOs were supporting them. Because I guess you can say Zelensky crossed the red line. He actually went after, NGO, not directly, but, NGO controlled agencies. And that set off some alarm bells. But, maybe he saw it coming. He understood because, again, he went after them because he saw that the agencies were coming after him. And we had some, again, there was this Seymour Hersh story, which probably has problems. I mean, there are a lot of, but a lot of the stuff he says about Ukraine is not true. But there may have been a big kernel of truth there, that the knives have been drawn and they're out to get Zelensky. It does seem consistent. What's happened since then seems to be consistent with, that notion.
Yeah, I wonder if they'll go through with it because I just feel like it'll be such a mess if they do get rid of Zelensky. I just don't see.
Yeah.
I
don't know
see
what
it
the
helping their
replacement's going
cause.
to be either. At the end, it's because
Zelensky?
Zelensky is, but I don't know. I think he's a better military. He's an actual military commander, of course. He was the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces. And he wasn't, I wouldn't describe him as brilliant, but he was more sensible. He understood military affairs and, the realities of conflict, military conflict, much better than Zelensky does. Zelensky is purely a media guy. That's his background. That's what he does. And for him, the information war, the only war that counts is the information war. Zelensky actually, more or less had his feet on the ground and understood there was a real war going on. And so he would say things like, we need to retreat from Avdiivka. We need to do this. We can't hold it. There's no point in just letting our men die there if we can't hold it. We got to pull back into more defendable positions. He would say those things, and Zelensky never wanted to hear it. And that's, I guess the main reason Zelensky was, is now in London, and we have Skirsky instead. But as far other than that, there's, really he's a bandite. Zelensky is, I guess that doesn't bother the West clearly, but he's very much, his general political outlook's the same. I don't really know why the West would want to get rid of Zelensky. What is it? Maybe he's just stealing too much. That may be a possibility. That may be what those investigations were leading to. They don't mind a certain amount of corruption, but he's just gone too far. That's one thing. Maybe they do, they understand the war is being lost, and it's being lost, more quickly under Zelensky, and they would rather have a Zelensky. It doesn't really solve their problems, but it does help somewhat, at least slow. I think Zelensky would be able to slow the Russian advance, maybe. I don't know what the motivation really is, or what the plan B is. The replacement would be.
Right. If they're even considering replacing Zelensky, it's just a sign of complete desperation. This is just one of the last type of moves they have to make before eventually, like I said, they're going to have to come to either they're fully committing to this war, and we're talking about a NATO war with Russia, which is just terrifying. I pray this never happens. or that Ukraine is going to collapse, right? I mean, they're at the limits of their support unless they get directly involved, right? So how close do you think we are to that moment?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. It's going to be. I think it may be like Avdiivka again. When Avdiivka fell, there was a lot of talk about sending troops. From Macron in particular. But yeah, I don't know. One thing I just is Zelensky himself was just saying. I think it may have been today or was it yesterday that he thought it was sending NATO troops wouldn't do any good. He said, like, what are they going to do? And I think he understands that these guys are trained for another war. That first of all, there really aren't there many of them other than the Americans, and the Americans have made it clear that they're just not going to do it. That's one thing that Trump has always been very clear on, and even Biden before him. Now we have certain leaders who say they want to do it, particularly the French and the British, but now maybe the Germans under Merz, but they just don't have the armies to do it. And that's what Zelensky was saying. Even if the numbers are very limited, the armies, they've been stripped to the bare bones. They've sent so many of their weapons to Ukraine. They don't have the interceptors. They don't have the artillery shells. They don't add a whole lot. You add some more bodies, but these are inexperienced bodies, and they don't really know how to fight this war. So what can they do?
Yeah,
it's just
right. I mean, if the whole West is really running on empty, they don't have any military fighting forces to speak of. They don't have air defenses. They don't even have offensive capabilities are limited as well. Everything's been treated through Ukraine and through Israel and the Houthis. Do you see that this will lead to, in like 10 years, all these U.S. bases is sort of shutting down, getting kicked out? Will there be some type of repercussions when it becomes apparent that, okay, NATO isn't actually a military fighting force to be scared of anymore? They're not even a force. Their tank is empty. They're out of gas. What can you do? Will that cause some type of power vacuum void, and we'll see, people start to move in, or we're going to enter into peaceful multipolarity? I mean, this is the argument that people will make. It's like Pax Americana. We're out there holding it, and if we leave, there will be this power vacuum. And maybe there's some truth to it. I don't know.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's. I don't see. One thing is that the aggressive powers really are not on the other side. In spite of all the propaganda that we hear, there aren't countries. Russia is not poised to invade Europe.
You need to convince a lot of people of that, though.
Yeah, but I mean, they just aren't. Yeah, there's just no reason. They never have.
I know.
You say, well, they invaded Ukraine, but they were saying that Ukraine was a red line and it was unacceptable, and that it, for a long time before finally they act on it. They haven't been saying anything about Poland or the Baltics or anything like that. It's clear that Ukraine was the red line, and that they were not going to accept NATO membership or de facto NATO membership, and that's why it happened. It's not something that they though it was a surprise in a sense that when they did it. The fact that they did it should not be a surprise. They were telegraphing that for years ahead. And they don't want to take on NATO. They're not going to do it. So, I mean, Russia is not that aggressive power. Iran is not that aggressive power. Now, China maybe one day will take back Taiwan because they consider it their own territory. And in fact, the U.S. and the West actually acknowledges that Taiwan is Chinese territory. Now, China has made it clear they don't want to use military means, but if they are forced to, like if Taiwan, for example, declares independence, then they will. Now it could affect the exposure of the West's military weakness can certainly affect the calculations, for example, of the Chinese. I don't think they're poised and they're planning an imminent invasion of Taiwan, but it's something. It's their plan B. Let's just put it that way. They would rather have a peaceful reunification, and they're working towards that. But if they can't, as they have said, this is not just some wild theory on my part. as they have said, if it becomes clear that peaceful unification is not a possibility, they will resort to military means. Now, the question is at what point would they do that? And if it becomes increasingly obvious, well, it is becoming increasingly obvious, but if this obvious fact that the West, is a lot weaker than, we had previously understood, and particularly in the area of air defense, that's going to affect their calculations. And it may just be that, okay, they're reluctant to do this because they would rather not have a war with the U.S. They figure they could win it, but it would be costly. But if it looks like it's going to be easy, like the U.S. can only fight for 3 days and then it's going to be out of missiles, that may change the way they look at the whole situation. And it may make it more likely that they will resort to military means than otherwise.
Mm-hmm. True. Yeah, I imagine all these countries around the world are having a major reassessment of the United States and NATO, militarily, economically, morally. So it just seems like the writing's on the wall for the West. We see how it all play out. But with the United States and Israel, something we always have to watch out for are these trick plays, some type of weird gimmick that they're going to try to pull something out, a rabbit out of the hat type of trick. And something that people are talking about, and I wonder if you can explain to me more, is this whole situation with Armenia and this idea of building some type of a corridor to attack Iran potentially, or I don't know if they're going to use it against Russia. Like, what's going on in the Caucasus? Is there anything there that we should really be paying attention to, or is this just a...
Yeah, let's see, what is it? It's the
Pashinyan?
Yeah, Pashinyan is the president of Armenia. And then the corridor is called, I think it's something like the Zazavor, I'm forgetting again, I'm terrible with names. Okay, but it's a corridor that runs along, it's a strip of land in southern Armenia. And what it would do is connect Azerbaijan to an Azerbaijani exclave. And that's, it's a piece of Azerbaijani land that is separated from the main body of Azerbaijan. And it's over there in close to Turkey and kind of there in the southwestern corner of Armenia. So they've been asking for, and in fact, at the end of the most recent war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, the Armenians agreed to a transportation corridor, is what they called it. It would be, just so that this strip of land along their southern border they would cede a certain amount of control to Azerbaijan. That was the idea. Now, this is something that the Azerbaijanis would like, and the Turks would also like, because it actually connects the two of them, and they could actually, they would be able to. It would facilitate trade, and who knows, in general, strengthen the connection between these two countries, which are already strong allies. It would be bad for Armenia. It would also be very bad for Iran, because Iran has a border with Armenia, and now there would be this strip of land which essentially cut them off. I mean, it certainly could. Once Turkey and Azerbaijan gain control of this, even though it's supposed to be a limited control, who knows what's going to happen, and they may be able to simply. If they decide to, close the border to Iran, they would have that power, regardless of what Armenia might think. And with this,
would they want to do that?
Transportation, would they want to do that? Well, they might.
What's the relationship? Does Azerbaijan not like Iran?
Okay, it's again, Azerbaijan is actually, I think, as I've mentioned in a previous episode, it's very similar. The Turkish government, Aliyev is the president of Azerbaijan, Erdogan of Turkey, and they're similar, I think, in their outlook, and they tend to, they are, we talk about the great game again, between the collective West and, let's say, Russia and China and Iran, and they're not really part of that. They're their own thing. And they're allies, and they want to extend their influence within the regions. And Turkey in particular would see this as a great opportunity to extend its influence through Azerbaijan and beyond. It's rather similar in a way to what was it called, the David's Corridor that the Israelis have in mind for eastern Syria. It would be a way of connecting southern Syria, which they are clearly working to make kind of to subjugate. They have been extending their control into southern Syria, but they also have influence in northeastern Syria, through the Kurds there. And if with a corridor they could extend, they would have a direct land bridge to those Kurds, and then again there are Kurds in Iraq. So that's a way for them to again extend their reach. And I think Turkey is looking at it the same way, that we can have a direct land bridge to our ally here in Azerbaijan, and maybe then we can move beyond. Who knows where they would want to go from there? Maybe they would be an opportunity to eat up more of Armenia. Armenia is just being taken apart a piece at a time. It's a very weak state. I don't know exactly what these people have planned, but I think there's no question that they're rubbing their hands with glee. Aliyev and Erdogan. They're looking at a chance to strengthen their positions within the region.
But do you see these Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, the Caucasus nations getting involved in these conflicts with Iran or with Russia, or are they just staying out of it? I mean, it seems like they're in this position right between these two countries that are, there seems would be obviously a lot of influence from the West to use them to their ability somehow.
Yeah. Well, that's
wondering.
Exactly. Right. Well, in the case of Armenia, Pashinyan is clearly trying to reorient Armenia to the West. I think his goal is to make it a member of the EU and of NATO. Armenia is still a member of the, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and then there's the other kind of that organization of former USSR republics that the Russians created. But he's given every indication, and more than an indication, he's made, he's changed policy. He's redirecting Armenia towards Europe. And that's his plan. He wants to make it a part of Europe. It's kind of similar, of course, to like what happened in the Maidan in Ukraine, right? That was a decision to turn west. Before, Ukraine was essentially neutral, and then tried to maintain, balance its relations between West and East, between Europe and the U.S. on one hand and Russia on the other. But then they made that after the Maidan coup, basically, they made a sharp turn to the West, and that's what we see happening in Armenia. So, we can expect direct Western involvement in Armenia. And then we have, you may have heard, I don't know who, somebody in the Trump administration, maybe Trump himself, proposed that the whole corridor could be rented to the U.S. Again, it sounds like it has the,
real estate stamp of.
Yeah, the real estate. Yeah, the real estate. I think it's got his fingerprints all over it. I think that's one of these big deals that he want to make. And the Armenians said they never heard about it. They don't know what he's talking about. But America is becoming increasingly involved in Armenia along with the Europeans. Now, Azerbaijan, like Turkey, they just play this double game. And again, they're for themselves. They're not really on either side. But they play this double game, and sometimes they lean one way, sometimes they lean the other. Of course, recently Azerbaijan has picked a fight with Russia, and that may be just for I don't know if it's part really strategic or as a reaction of certain moves that the Russians made, like the destruction of the Azerbaijani oil refinery within Ukraine, or maybe the crackdown on the Azerbaijani criminal networks within Russia.
Okay, well, I guess we'll see what happens over there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard for me to believe though that someone like Pashinyan would want to side with the EU and the West at this stage. I understand in 2014 with the Maidan coup, there's a lot of geopolitical capital on the West to be like, oh, this is what we want to be part of, integrate ourselves with the West. But it's like, has he been living under a rock the past 3 years? It's like, oh yes, let's join NATO. It's like they don't. You think NATO's going to protect you? Have you been seeing what's happening in Ukraine? They don't have any missiles. They don't have any defense. Why would you want to be part of NATO at this point? Like, I just can't think of, unless it's just political corruption. It's like, okay, well, I'll get real rich because I'll secure some deal and they'll just wire transfer me a ton of money. I mean, maybe that's what it is.
It always could be, I admit. Yeah. Yeah, it
okay,
is.
well,
you should jump. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I was just going to move to some other news and just get your thoughts on it. So, I think you saw that France says it's going to recognize the state of Palestine
Right.
in September, I believe. Is this hugely significant, or is this a?
I wouldn't say it's hugely significant. First of all, um, there just isn't going to be a two-state solution. And, I wish I didn't have to say that, but it's just true. The chance of a two-state solution, I think, passed 25, 30 years ago. It's long been um, an impossibility. Now it's the official stance of all kinds of countries, because that's the official UN resolution. And if it had been, a real effort had been to implement that resolution back when it was made, way back in, I guess it was shortly after the Six-Day War, um, then something could have been done. But that's not what happened. In the end, the U.S. did not really put any, they voted for it, as I understand it. That's their official stance and has been the official stance of the U.S. government for a long time. But they never put any muscle behind it, and in fact, they've done quite the opposite. And of course, they've supported all the Israeli efforts to delay and to sabotage it. And now it's just too late. It has some symbolic impact. France is the first of the G7 countries to take the step. It does, it may not happen, but it does shine a light on Israel's intransigence. It puts a little bit of diplomatic pressure on them. The Israeli government has reacted very angrily to it, as the U.S. government has. But it doesn't really change anything. And I don't, I don't expect it will. But again, it's indicative, I think, of the shifting ground, the growing anger and among people, and within the broader population, but even higher ranking people, that in various institutions and even in the media. I've been struck by some of the stories. I was reading, I guess it was a CNN story, and CNN is hardly sympathetic, doesn't have a history of being sympathetic to the Palestinians. It's just, typically it's been very much a pro-Zionist outfit. And more importantly, I've seen reports from them that were surprisingly honest about what was happening in Gaza. But then there was even this piece I saw in the New York Times this morning that struck me. I saw the title and I said, okay, I'll read this, but it's just going to be a bunch of garbage. But it was pretty honest about, the horrors of Gaza, and it didn't try very hard anyway to exculpate the Israelis. It did say outright, is IDF soldiers are shooting these people or starving people that are trying to get aid, and they're deprived of that aid by the Israelis. It was there. So I'm struck. I think that the Israelis have gone so far that it just, the truth can't be hidden, and some of their best friends are beginning to turn against them. We still don't see any substantive change in policy anywhere, and I wouldn't call this, recognition of Palestine by France substantive, but it may, reflect something. It's just a reality, the reality of changing opinion, and maybe a harbinger of something that's to come, something that's going to be real and substantive down the road.
Right. I just feel like like I said, the ground is shifting. On BBC News as well, you'll often see some fairly accurate reporting about just the crimes that are being committed there. They'll often balance it with some IDF guy or some Israeli sympathizer. But in general, I think the majority of people are seeing now just how awful things are in Gaza. And okay, Macron says he'll recognize Palestine as a state. I think like the Spanish prime minister says that Israel's committing a genocide. The media is starting to turn on them a bit. It just feels like, how far does it have to go at what point, when you have 80-90% of the world, Western world, that is aware of what's going on, like, when will it get to a point where it'll actually have a real effect? I mean, are we just going to have to endure this genocide on our phones while all of our political leaders maybe give lip service occasionally, but do nothing substantive in real action until Israel strikes Iran again and starts another war and goes crazy? And then that's what we have to wait for. Do you think what do you think, if you're a betting man?
Well, I guess I'm very cynical and pessimistic because I've seen Israel get away with murder for such a long time, especially since October 7th, but certainly before then. And I guess I've begun to, adopt the view that things never change. It's always going to be this way. But I think that's wrong. Things are changing, and there will be, real repercussions to what Israel's done. It's a question of when rather than if. Again, I'm pessimistic. I think it's I tend to assume it'll be years down the road. Maybe it'll be a whole generation, but I might be wrong. Again, I was kind of taken aback. It's like New York Times has been one of the number one, Zionist propaganda organs within the U.S. for decades and decades and decades, and yeah, they were saying things that it was pretty honest. I think they could have been, there was some evidence to kind of soften the reality, but not much. Some effort to do that, but not much. And then I'm struck, I think recently in the New York Times, there was a piece by a genocide scholar, I think from Brown University. And he said, this is a genocide. He said, I've been resisting this. I didn't want to say this. Okay, but I have to admit that this is a genocide. And this was published in the New York Times. A lot of people read that, probably people who just love Israel. And I'm sure it affected quite a few of them. I'm sure he changed some minds. So there's something happening. Again, these sort of things are like an avalanche. They're hard to predict. You look at the mountain slope and it's just one solid, it's unbroken blanket of snow all the way up to the peak. But there are things that are happening, the temperature's changing slightly, and, there's it could be just a very minor, event, an incident. It could even, just be a loud bang or something that can trigger it. And then all of a sudden, this slope that seemed so solid can just come crashing down. And, that's often how social change happens. It can, something that never changes, it just seems unchangeable. Like the Soviet Union, it can fall in historically speaking, just a blink of an eye. And maybe that we're seeing like those first kind of indications of the approaching avalanche. I just would like to think that. Again, like if you look at what these governments are actually doing, it's all talk, nothing's happened. And I don't know if Macron or these people are incapable of doing anything that's substantive, anything that's real. But maybe they'll get thrown out, and maybe there will be, somebody who replaces them will do something really different. I'm still very pessimistic, but I have to admit there's a chance that there could be sudden and radical change. I think, what Israel has done has really woken up quite a few people, and some of those people are influential, and it's seeped into these very important media outlets. They're really the pinnacles of the media landscape, and that means something. That's going to have real consequences.
Yeah, I wonder if, Zionist control is just so total when it comes to our Congress, but not only that, just the deep state itself, the intelligence agencies. Like,
Yeah.
can we have any change and actually have a real substantive change of policy towards Israel as long as those agencies are fully captured? Don't they have to be dismantled? Like, the deep state is just going to deep state. I mean, even if you elect people that you think might, or have a true America First stance and doesn't want to support Israel and its genocide in Gaza, will they ever actually be able to do anything? Can we get a change? It's like, no, the Zionists have control, throughout all levels of government, these
Yeah,
unelected
no, it's going
bureaucrats,
to,
the deep
yeah,
state.
you're right. I mean, it is. That's the reality. So even if he did get somebody, now Trump obviously wasn't that person. He always has been a Zionist. We had some hopes for him because he occasionally says things, we've talked about all those things before. He's done some things that make you wonder how much of a committed Zionist he is. But again, yeah, he's not going to be the one who's going to do that. But if you got somebody in there who really wants to change something, could he do it? If Mamdani was elected president, that's not going to happen, obviously. But if he were, could he actually change anything? He would be up against this huge apparatus. It would be an enormous fight. And probably not, but even the fight would weaken that deep state. Everything that's happened so far, I mean, they're still in power, but one thing that has changed, the fact that, okay, they're still there, they still have their hands on the levers of power, they are within that establishment, they are unopposed. Their power is total. But they have been exposed in a way that they never were before. Again, I know you've brought this up, but it's very true. It's just that people didn't talk about, except for, few people, really committed activists, never really talked about Zionist control or the power of AIPAC. That was a very naughty thing to talk about in the past. When John Mearsheimer came out with his book, which he co-authored with Stephen Walt, The Israel Lobby, was that back in it was during the 2000s. It was, roundly condemned. They were accused of being anti-Semites. Now these were such big names, they could do it and they could withstand the criticism. But it was a very brave thing for them to do. It actually really took guts. They were roundly attacked. And, all the media organs, certainly the New York Times condemned it, and because they were such, well-regarded professors from such prestigious universities, it was something they could do. But now, what they said there seems kind of tame right now. And a lot of people are saying it. And now it's just kind of a well-known fact. This was fringe back then. It was very daring, but now it's 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 not the 5%, it's the 50% or something that is talking openly about this. That's a change, so even if these people are in charge, their power and in the end, and their actions, the support for this injustice has had a light shine on it, and just the shining of that light has weakened them. They were much stronger when they were in the dark, and people only could whisper about them, or there's only a few people out on the fringes who could say something. That has changed. So yeah, they're powerful, and they're going to hang on to power, and they may hang on to power for a long time. But I think that again, it's just like the clock is ticking against them. This is the beginning of the end. It may still be years and years in the future where they finally fall. And maybe that we have 75% of the population that is strongly against Zionism, and they'll still be there. But it can't keep on going. It's unsustainable, for much longer.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, you're saying if you take somebody to really fight Zionism now, the deep state will go, how would it fight back? And maybe they couldn't get it done. But I think just the fact that we have a lack of fight right now against this, that it is confirming all these suspicions of people. It's like, wait, why are we sending all this money to Israel? Why won't you release the Epstein case? Why can't we do America first? Why does Israel have free healthcare? I don't like seeing these videos of all these kids being blown up in Gaza. Why are we still sending them money? We have the power to end it. Why did we bomb Iran? All these questions are just coming up. And the fact that they just try to like not talk about it or shove it on the rug or just say, I stand with Israel, Israel has the right to defend itself, I think is really damning them, because everyone's like, well, now there's something clearly wrong. We're not, how stupid do you think we are? And so now all of a sudden, all these, these things that were just fringe conspiracy theories are front and center, and everybody is looking at it. Yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about Epstein just a little bit more. I know you listened to that Tucker Carlson interview with Daryl Cooper. Just what do you think the whole fallout of this thing is going to be? How convinced are you, how big of an operation this was, and what are your thoughts on this, and what's going to come of all this?
Right. Well, I don't know. The fact is, because the Daryl Cooper interview was excellent. And I'm very glad that I spent the time to listen to the whole thing, and I would recommend it to all our viewers. One thing he doesn't actually get into that. It's just like, let's look at, we don't know how big the operation was. Sometimes it may not be as big as we think about it, or it may have been somewhat different. What's clear, what's been proven in the courts, is that Epstein himself, abused these underage women, girls, and on a tremendous scale with the help of Ghislaine Maxwell. I think that's proved beyond a doubt. Now, there's just a lot of circumstantial evidence, but we have to say it's circumstantial. Nothing else has been proved that powerful people, may have, let's say, availed themselves of services provided by, I guess using a really euphemism, Epstein. In other words, that slept with these underage girls that Epstein had procured. But it seems like that. He had these private islands. We know that he had these cameras, at his residences. There are people that have it reported to the media, maybe not in court, that, yeah, he was collecting this data. And the plane that people would fly to the private island was called the Lolita Express, which of course refers to actually a 12-year-old girl who slept with who was abused by this older man in a novel, Nabokov.
That's the audacity. Wow.
So
crazy.
This was a name that, this is a name that actually the people who took the plane gave it. So they knew what was going on, and something, they knew it. And so, there are all these powerful men that go on this island. I know, like I'll say, Michael Tracy, he's useful. He's sort of a contrarian, you might call him. He's not a defender of the establishment, but he fought really hard to say, hey, none of this other stuff has been proven. Like if you look at a lot of these testimonies by these different women, they actually didn't make this in court. They got a lot of money out of it, but when they were brought to court and cross-examined, a lot of them said, no, I made that up. This is what he says. So it hasn't been proven, but there's just so much circumstantial evidence that it just seems to me hard to believe that something wasn't going on there. And it's also clear, though, again, this hasn't been proven in a court of law, it's clear that Epstein had a lot of connections with the Israeli government. He was a friend of something like 3 or 4 prime ministers, and a very good friend of Ehud Barak, who was, I should say not prime minister, but president, a former president of Israel, who would visit him at his home, on many occasions. And, the Maxwells and so on, he's just surrounded by people who obviously were deeply involved, in Israeli intelligence. And you look at this mix, and if you come to the conclusion there must have been some sort of, honeypot scheme going here, that doesn't seem to me like a wacky conspiracy theory. Let's just put it that way. It just seems like a very rational conclusion. And now I know there are a lot of people in the press now that are saying that, oh, this is fringe conspiracy theory. It says, well, it almost seems like, okay, I can't prove this absolutely, but you need to prove me wrong because it sure looks like that. And we need to be really transparent. You got to open the files. You need to conduct an investigation, a real investigation. That just that it doesn't stop at certain points because intelligence is involved or whatever. I think clearly something was going on, and the Israelis are involved. One thing is like when he was first charged back in Florida, when he was actually arrested in the 2000s it was just a joke. He spent the night in jail and then could go anywhere during the day. And he didn't have just one cell. He had the whole wing of a jail given to him. I mean, it's just absurd. I can't believe that was the arrangement. But before that, he fled to Israel. That's the country he went to. Now, this is one place where I actually disagreed with Daryl Cooper, where he said that, a lot of people are thinking that, right, if we actually find out what's going to happen, we'll learn that he was an asset of, Israeli intelligence, an asset of the Mossad. And he says, well, I don't think it's actually so much that. I think he worked for everybody. But it just seemed like it was clear that his relationship with Israel was especially tight. That's the country he fled to. And he waited until his lawyers could work out a deal while he was in Israel. Then he went back. So, I can't prove it. I guess none of us can, because the investigation that should have been done wasn't done. But it sure looks like he was, an asset, a very important asset of the Mossad. And that's probably why this is not happening. It's just like, again, within the establishment, you cannot shine light in those places. It's not allowed. And so
it's crazy. You just think about how much time and energy the U.S. government put into something like trying to prove the Russiagate, the Russia collusion hoax, all this energy. And then with Epstein, it's like, we can't devote anybody, no special counsel, nobody. Sorry, we don't have the resources. We are busy with other things, like it's so silly. It's like the fact that they won't investigate it or do anything to look at it is just clear to, I think, everybody that there's something seriously wrong here. So it's a serious cover up. I'm just afraid. I don't think this will happen. I don't think they can just kick it under the rug, but we've seen it happen so many times, like with Russiagate, for example. It goes on for years and years. Okay, it was nothing to see here. Let everybody move on, and then we just kind of forget about it. Now, of course, they're trying to revive it, I think, in an attempt to distance themselves from Epstein. It's like, look at this scandal here. We'll pull out all these other government scandals as red meat for you guys, so that way you don't look at the big one here, the Epstein one. I feel like that's what's going on.
It may be.
I don't think we'll let it go.
Actually, right. But I think also actually like, the document release concerning the Russia hoax, that is something that started, before this particular controversy broke out. So that may just be a coincidence. Certainly looking at it now, it seems like, they probably
the timing of it, though.
You may be right. Yeah, it's certainly possible. But anyway, but it doesn't seem to be going away. It's something I think it has done permanent damage to Trump. It's more than anything else. A lot of other things should have damaged Trump, like his attack on Iran, but within his base, unfortunately, it did not. Just to be honest. Again, people like, the people that we know, the thinking supporters of Trump, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and so on and so forth, and, of course, Tucker Carlson. Yeah, they were very angry about that, rightly so, about the attack in Iran. But something like 95% of the base supported it. That's the unfortunate truth. But that's not true of the Epstein scandal. I think that has cut into his base. And even if it dies down over time, it's never going to go away entirely. And there are some people that are going to be permanently disaffected from Trump. I think he did permanent damage. He really, and he's dying to make it go away. But it's something that really mattered to people. Again, we within the foreign policy community, are very concerned, and I think very rightly so, about these foreign wars and so on. But that's generally not true of the average American. They often just don't understand. Maybe they're not really firm supporters, except with the exception, unfortunately, of Israel. They're not firm supporters of these wars, but neither are they very passionate opponents. But Epstein and what he represented is something that they really hate. They really understand too. It's something within kind of their realm of experience, and they know they hate it. And you can't just spin it and hope that it'll go away. It won't go away.
Do you think we should be focusing more of a light on the connection between Epstein and Israel? I think sometimes people don't want to go there, because of just, the blowback you get from AIPAC and the Israel lobby. But it seems like, even Daryl Cooper was saying that, maybe it's not exactly a Mossad agent. But it sounds like you're saying, obviously he was very close.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's based on a lot of the other things that I've said and that he said, along with other things I know. It just is so clear that his focus was always on Israel. I mean, that's the most powerful people that he associated with were Zionists. And the government that he, whose presidents he socialized with, those were Israeli presidents. The country that he fled to when he got in trouble was Israel. And so I'm sorry, I think that if you shine a line on it, you may find that I'm sure he was involved. I very strongly suspect, I should say, that he was, he had CIA connections and probably with some other foreign intelligence services. He just operated in that milieu, the kind of things he did, basically what he did. Nobody really knows exactly how he made his money, but he was good at hiding money and kind of what we call money laundering. He was a very important person for all kinds of powerful people and for intelligence agencies. One thing intelligence agencies do is they work with these shady characters. They often work, even with crime networks. It happens everywhere in the world. And so he was the kind of person, you look at his islands, you look at the kind of business he did, you look at the open associations he had, and it just has, Mossad stamped all over it. So, again, it's circumstantial, but there's one point where circumstantial evidence rises to the point where you say, I'm sorry, but I just believe he did this. You got to prove me wrong. No, and maybe, right. Maybe sometimes you might be surprised something that you were sure was there wasn't there, but it sure looks like it. Yeah. So anyway, you're just saying about, it would be a problem, let's say, if it was MI6 or whatever, the CIA would want to protect them. They would try to shut it down. But we just know, it's just like we cannot let this happen. This would be just fatal to Mossad and the Israelis and all their supporters who are so powerful within our government. It says, you cannot, let this happen. And they're doing, they got to be turning the screws and bending arms and whatever to make sure it doesn't happen. It's kind of like the USS Liberty. This was President Johnson was actually initially very angry about it. I know I mentioned that, but it's just that all the supporters of Israel within his administration, and they began applying the pressure, and it was a combination of carrots and sticks, and finally, okay, we're covering this up. And I bet that's what's happening behind the scenes right now. There's a lot of carrots and sticks, okay, we'll give you this, but if you dare to go there, oh boy, we're going to do this to you,
It's so crazy.
But the thing is, so let me just add real quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
It was one thing that caused Johnson to shut up. He actually initially, even speaking with Newsweek, he said, it was the Israelis. He did it off the record, but he actually did tell a reporter. And then later he just shut up. And one of the things that the Israelis, let's say they were American Jewish Zionists, scared him with was that you were going to be, you will be denounced as an anti-Semite, and just in no uncertain terms. And he was scared of that. But I just wonder if at some point what's going to happen is some powerful person, and it could even happen now because things have changed. It's like that charge of anti-Semitism is starting to lose its sting. It's been overused, and we see what's happening in Gaza, and just the horrible hypocrisy, or just really the absolutely shameful concern about your image is people that are more afraid of being called an anti-Semite than They're so afraid that they won't stand up against a genocide. I mean, just this fact is something that people are looking at and thinking about, and they're starting to think, hey, this whole term anti-Semitism has been weaponized. It's been overused. I think a lot of people understand that now. It used to be, it could be a death sentence, and it was, or at least a career death sentence for journalists and other congressmen and so on and so forth in the past. And it's still something that people are afraid of, but I don't think it has a sting. And it may be that at some point, somebody, who really can make a difference, will say, I don't care, call me an anti-Semite. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to expose this. That's something we can hope for. That's one of the things, one of the kind of where the dam might break.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's in 2025, if you're not being called an anti-Semite, if you're not called an anti-Semite, then you're on the wrong side of history. It's like, it's coming to the point where it's almost like,
right.
That's almost where it's like, because it's just sharing, people like, I have a little toddler and a little baby. We watch Miss Rachel every now and then. It's a little kid show. She's great. It helps Felix talk and stuff. And she's being labeled as this huge anti-Semite because she cares about the children in Gaza getting blown up. It's just this big campaign against her. It's crazy. It's just so crazy. But then I'm just wondering if it starts to come out, though, the more that we focus on this Epstein story and it doesn't go away, I know they're trying to bury it. It's not going to happen. And the more that people look into it and the more comfortable people are talking about it, and then the connection Epstein has with Israel and Israeli intelligence and starts to permeate in the general consciousness of the American people that, Israel was trafficking little girls and boys, little kids, American kids. So our political elite and powerful people could rape them and blackmail the country and control the country. And we are learning this truth come out. It starts to permeate the consciousness of the American people while Israel's committing a genocide in Gaza, and at the same time, committing atrocities in, Yemen and in the West Bank and Lebanon, Syria, Iran, wherever. It just, a lot of times I look at conflicts in the history, we always try to paint them as, good guy, bad guy. And then the reality you learn, it's much more nuanced. It's gray, there was complicated. But what we have here seems to me just like a true evil. And then we need to fight it. That's what it feels like. But, I don't want to go overboard. I'm scared to say that because I don't want to label a whole nation, and you can't. There are very brave people in Israel that are standing up against it, but obviously a very small minority. And I don't want to have real violence that are just to anybody that's Jewish, even if they support, Palestine. Like that. That's the fear. But what I'm seeing come out of Zionism to me is it is the encapsulation of evil, and just what it's doing in itself in Gaza is irredeemable. And then you throw on top of it this, evil blackmailing of our politicians by trafficking children so that our elite can rape them. It's beyond it's just so disgusting, so awful. I'm afraid of the repercussions. Like there has to be a price to pay.
Yeah, well,
I'm also afraid I don't want to go overboard.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a danger, and the solution, according to the ADL, for example, is that people have to stop criticizing Israel, but that's obviously not the solution. It's the reality. It's what Israel is doing, that is causing people to grow in anger against Israel, and by extension, because let's be honest, we're not talking about Israeli Arabs. By and large, it's almost entirely Israeli Jews, and Israel is constantly telling us that we are the Jewish nation. It's hard to prevent that from spilling over into just a general anger, and then eventually hardening into a hatred against Jews, which would be wrong. But the solution is not, hey, let's just try to hide the reality and just denounce anybody that points to it. That's what's happening. That's what the ADL and other Jewish and Zionist organizations are doing. The solution, obviously, is to stop it. And the solution is obviously, to to stop supporting it, bring it to an end, and support, all along we've been supporting, the U.S. has been supporting Zionism in Israel, ever since the beginning, but especially, as time has gone by, even more, unconditionally. And we've helped to feed this monster. We have to, now it's time to cut it off. We don't starve the children. We got to starve Zionism. We got to starve no more funds to Israel until they stop it. And that's the only way that we can actually bring about a change. And if you want, to prevent anti-Semitism, real anti-Semitism, from, the kind of anti-Semitism that results in violent acts against Jews just because they're Jews, you want to prevent that from happening, then stop supporting the genocide, bring it to an end as quickly as possible. It has to be said that I mentioned like these pieces in the newspaper, we talked about Macron's statement, but there are even things happening in Israel. There are so few people that have done anything. I mean, it's a very small community that is opposed to war and has shown any real concern for what's happening to the Gazans. But it has grown somewhat. There have, within especially the last few weeks in Israel, there have been some demonstrations. They're pretty small, but they weren't even happening before. There was a woman who was on an Israeli news show recently who said, look, I know that we're not supposed to say this. We always criticize the war because, well, we want the hostages. We're worried about our IDF boys, whatever. But also, we got to stop this war because of what it's doing to the Gazans. We got to stop starving children. She said this on Israeli TV, and this was very brave. It's very hard. She took a real risk, and she was immediately denounced by some of the other people that were on this particular panel or whatever. But she kept on talking, and that was the first. Apparently, like since October 7th, this is like the first time anyone had actually gone out and said that on Israeli TV. So there's some things. We're talking about very small numbers, but there are very brave people. And then I think maybe equally significant was some of the statements by Mike Huckabee, our ambassador to Israel, right? I mean, this guy is an extreme Zionist, and we've talked about that in the past. But he actually seems to be genuinely upset by some of the things that the Israelis have done, like the attack on the Catholic Church. He went to, maybe this one thing we've talked about, okay, the Israelis, they don't differentiate between Muslims and Christians. If they're Palestinians, they're not Jewish, we kill them all. And that's what's been happening in Gaza. It's been what's been happening in the West Bank. Could American Christians actually start to worry about fellow Christians? Well, at least Mike Huckabee seems to be doing that. Like he went to the village Taibeh. That was the village that I visited. It's, the last remaining Christian town within the West Bank. And it's been under attack recently. The settlers have gone in there and they've burned houses. They desecrated a church there. And he went there and, he expressed his anger, and he said, in certain terms, he said, this is unacceptable. You can't do this. And he's more than that. He's not just talking about Christians, he actually has condemned some of the attacks on aid seekers and so on. He could go a lot farther, and I'm sure he often qualifies what he says, but he didn't say those things before. Nobody ever made the statement on Israeli TV. We're talking about just little cracks in the dam. I know that's none of these things. The policy hasn't changed. The money flows. The people are dying. Nothing has really changed. But we are seeing some things, that we just never saw before. And I think, again, like I said earlier in this particular podcast, that these all may be harbingers of something to come. Maybe eventually, the avalanche will hit us. And, we're just seeing the first very, small changes, but it's just any one of those changes at some point could be a trigger.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Huckabee is an ultra Zionist, so him, I did see that comment, when you visit Taipei, and saying that that is a huge thing for if you're losing Mike Huckabee, then you've gone really far. We'll see. I'm sure he's still a good little Zionist and will support the genocide as much as he can.
He hasn't, right. But yes, something got through to him. Some things are starting to make just a little.
Right. Well,
one little bowl that's been lit in his mind.
Right. I mean, you saying that there's this woman going on Israeli television and saying like, "Look, we gotta stop starving children," and how brave that was. I mean, first it just puts into perspective just
Yeah,
how far the society has gone. If we have to, if it requires somebody to be brave to say like, maybe we shouldn't starve kids. Like,
right.
this
Yeah,
is
no, no.
so
Yeah, on the
evil.
one hand, it
Starving
shows how
children.
dark the situation is, but yet at the same time, nobody had done it before. That's what I'm
Right.
saying. Yeah, right.
Right.
So
But
but it also exposes the horror of the current situation. You're right.
Right, but I mean, it just shows you how, maybe just having one person just say that could, like you said, it could start to, break the dam. Because it's
Right.
just something that is just so a fundamental truth. Like, we shouldn't
Right.
even have to say this, like, hey,
Right.
we can't be starving these children. And then maybe just take somebody to just to even hear that, like, maybe that's right. Like, it's crazy to even say that, but it's just like, yeah, what are we doing here? What are you guys
Yeah.
doing? How can you live with yourselves? Starving all of these people. The footage is so awful. I can't bear it. I go through, because I end up liking a lot of them because I want to spread the awareness of what's happening. But then I get the unfortunate thing of my feed being filled, and I sometimes have to skip through, and it hits more for me because I have little boys as well, and I see children that are the same age as my kids, and it's
Hmm.
so heartbreaking. I just can't believe that this is happening and everybody's okay. It's just one of the most basic evils, and you think that we're supposed to be able to stand up to evil, and it's just so disappointing that all of our politicians just can't stand up. That we just can't. That they're all compromised. That they're all complicit. That they're all just equally evil or just selfish. I can't believe it. Like how many. Like it's amazing how many people like flew on Epstein's plane and like called the Lolita Express. It just made me just think like the elites, they're just such degenerates.
Yeah.
Is that just
Right.
something that happens when you just get super powerful and wealthy? Just so many people fall into it, and they,
Yeah.
that personality that lets you reach the top just encourages that behavior, and you're with other
Right.
people, and you all have formed this band, and you rule the world, and they're all just evil scum.
Yeah.
It's
Right. Well,
disgusting.
actually, yeah. Again, I think the best discussion of that reality, of the degeneracy of the ultra powerful, is the best discussion I've ever heard was actually between Tucker Carlson and Daryl Cooper. So I would recommend it. That happens towards the end of that particular interview, but it's they're both commenting on that. It's not just like there are a few corrupt individuals, but it seems to be just a characteristic of this class of people. They may not all of them engage in these acts, but they all they accept it. For them, it's no big deal. It's a shrug of the shoulders. Yeah, it's because I guess there's a sense that when you become so powerful that you're above morality, and you don't have those silly concerns about right and wrong that normal people have. You don't. Um, anyway, yeah, I would
Yeah.
recommend that. And then I maybe I'd just like to throw one other person, make one other mention of somebody, that a surprise, someone you thought you would never hear speaking out against Israel. But she did it. I'm talking about Cindy McCain, the widow of John McCain. And you
Oh,
remember who
really?
John McCain was? Of course, he was Lindsey Graham's best buddy, and the two of them were for every war, and always, support Israel to the hilt. And she never showed any signs of being anything different. But she became involved actually in the UN food program, and so she learned about things and saw things directly. And so she said, just quite clearly, this is what Israel is starving these children, and it's got to stop. Yeah. Again,
Yeah.
this is it's just another example. And so the good thing is like when somebody like Cindy McCain or Mike Huckabee, because they are in general they're known for being supporters of Israel, and their supporters are often ardent Zionists. And so when people like this speak out against Israel, I know that like in Mike Huckabee's case, we're just talking about a few exceptions to his general support for Israel. But even so, shines a ray of light into what's a very dark room. Again, these people who never heard, criticism from Israel from somebody that they trusted. They heard it, but they always could say, "Oh, those stupid leftists" or whatever. They're always saying that kind of stuff. That's what they do because they're leftists. But they can't simply dismiss a comment from Mike Huckabee or from Cindy McCain. So again, there are rays of light. I mean, it's horrible. Absolutely, the horror continues unabated, but there are rays of hope.
Yeah. Okay, Dad, I think we should end it there. I heard my wife knock, so I think I gotta go on dad duties now.
Okay, and
all right, yeah. Have a good rest of your day, or you're going to go to bed now, I guess. So a good rest of your night, good day tomorrow, good weekend. If anybody listened to the end, you can see that I have officially set up a shop. It's goodmorningdad.com. So if you want to pick up some merch, mugs or T-shirts, you can go check it out. I think they're actually pretty decent quality. So yeah, if you want to support, you can join the community or buy something from the shop. Okay. Have a good rest of your day. And yeah, have a great weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.